Yeah, good evening from my part also. In this presentation I shall talk to you about my doctoral dissertation. It's entitled In Our Body the Scripture Becomes Fulfilled, Gendered Bodyliness and the Making of the Gender System in Martin Luther's Anthropology. I defended it at the University of Helsinki in December 2017. I actually have started, I just started a postdoc project that is about religious identity building in German ego documents from the 16th century. But since this project is quite in the beginning, I prefer to talk about my dissertation today. So let's get on to business. Men have broad chest and narrow hips, therefore they are intelligent. Women have narrow chest and broad hips. They should stay at home. Their creation indicates this. They have broad bottoms so that they sit and be silent, as I am doing today. Martin Luther, who was one of the leading first generation reformers from the 16th century Germany, explicated this way the difference between men and women, male body and female body, and especially the superiority of men. This particular quotation is from Luther's table talk. It means that it's his informal talk to and often a bit drunk talks to and with his guests at the dinner table. As such, it does not describe the whole of his view on the human being, women and men and their bodyliness. But however, this quotation tells something important of the gender difference and hierarchy, as not only Luther but also his contemporaries understood them. I think you all are probably aware of the so-called starting shot of the Reformation, namely Luther's 95 Theses in 1517. And this is the picture of the event, even though scholars argue about whether the event has really happened or not. Of course, it is far too simplistic to regard merely these theses as the beginning of the Reformation. Rather, one could say that the ideological differentiation had been smoldering in Germany at least from the 14th century onwards. My thesis examines Luther's view of the human being during the early Reformation, the 1520s. It was a decade of ecclesiastical, social and political turmoil. During this decade, religious and political questions concerning, for instance, the right interpretation of communion or salvation, the power relationships between electors and bishops, and the fate of monasteries and convents and their inhabitants came under heated dispute. Not the least disputed was the question of clerical marriage that the evangelicals, which means Luther and his followers in the early Reformation, they began to favor it rapidly. Due to constantly changing situations, there was a lack of so-called socially constructed behavioral scripts, as often seems to be the case during times of rapid change. And thus the need to provide new behavioral models became significant, and Luther was one of the key figures to offer people these. In my study, I asked how gendered bodyliness was treated in Luther's discussions on femininity and masculinity, and consequently, in what way he constructed proper feminine and masculine ways of being and developed the gender system. In other words, under scrutiny were the ideals, norms, and expectations that he framed on the ground of the gendered body. Thirdly, I asked whether Luther's views varied according to historical and textual context. Thus, the vital perspectives in scrutinizing Luther's anthropology were gender, bodiliness, sexuality, and power. I was mostly inspired theoretically by the Finnish philosopher Sara Heinämaa and her discussions on gender from the viewpoint of body phenomenology. Sara Heinämaa's central conclusion is that it's not possible to define what is a man or a woman. Instead, it is possible to define a gendered way of being or a style. That is to decipher how to be a woman or a man. Way of being. And if considered as a way of being, gender can thus be understood as open and dynamic by nature. And accordingly, the concept of way of being was used in the study. I regard it as a conceptualization that takes into account the body-based gendered language of Luther, but which at the same time brings forth the intertwined nature of biological, social, cultural, and contextual dimensions of femininity and masculinity in his language. The penetrable idea that Luther deducted from gendered bodiliness was that of gender hierarchy, the woman's subordination and otherness, and the man's normativity and dominion. And this becomes evident not only in his theoretical writings, but also in very practical situations as well, which I looked at through his correspondence mainly. Luther could, for example, send his greetings to the wife of his friend in a letter the following way by saying, "Farewell to your rib." In his most extreme statements, Luther noted, "The female body is not strong and the spirit is even weaker. A woman is a half child. Whoever takes a wife, he should know that he is a guardian of a child. She is a wild animal. You recognize her weakness." This way of explicating womanhood was absolutely nothing new at the turn of the late Middle Ages and the early modern era. Compared to the ideas of preceding thinkers, these kinds of statements are not actually even extreme. One of the most influential teachers of the Catholic Church, Thomas Aquinas from the 13th century, had thought, for example, that, and I quote, "If there were no godly power that wants the feminine sex to exist, the birth of the woman would be like any other accident, as in the case of other monsters as well." Like Aquinas, Luther thought that due to God's will to create a feminine being, women should be respected. He especially praised women who fulfilled their gender destiny, so to say, that is, who became wives and mothers. This was the thing that Luther thought their bodies were created to. In Luther's view, God had created women for business, not pleasure, and that business was to give birth and nurse offspring. Motherhood was, in fact, such a praiseworthy, God-pleasing office that everyone should wish to have been born as women, as Luther noted. But he also, in practice, praised women who did not fit into a role of a subservient wife and mother. In practice, he allowed some women positions that he denied them in theory. He praised women who, for example, defended in public similar theological ideas as his own. For example, Katharina Schütz-Zell and Argula von Krumbach, of whom I have pictures here, were among those loud-speaking, active, very public figures whom Luther praised as, for instance, enlightened by God's grace or special instruments of God. One fine example is, of course, Luther's wife, Katharina von Bora. Both Luther and his co-workers favored marriage for pastors from quite the beginning of the 1520s. Luther himself, as you all perhaps know, was an Augustinian eremite, a monk, and also a pastor, a secular pastor. He, however, himself was not keen to marry for various reasons that former research has studied. I suggest in my study that one critical factor was the social pressure that intensified during the years, and thereby it affected every evangelical-leaning pastor, including Luther himself. Hence, the need to construct his masculinity anew. His self-fashioning became the cornerstone of his action when he married. Now, Luther and von Bora married as late as in the summer of 1525. This happened years after Luther had presented his readers that celibate life was of the devil himself, not of God, and that if you did not marry, your human nature would anyhow force you to commit serious sins, such as fornication and masturbation. Even after the wedding, Luther tried to convince his public that the marriage was God's act, which actually had surprised himself. He wrote to his friend in this manner: "While I was thinking other things, God threw me marvelously into marriage with Katharina von Bora, that nun." Even though marriage was becoming, I think, an essential part of what it was to be an evangelical pastor, the marriage of a former monk and nun was still a scandal in many circles. Indeed, Luther's and von Bora's first child was feared to be a monster or Antichrist himself. Such a shocking relationship it was. Starting his marriage by calling his wife his rib, as in the case of his co-workers' wives as well, Luther ended up calling von Bora his lord, empress, and master, not only in feminine, but also in masculine. And this change happened only within a few years after the marriage. Actually, as swift as von Bora's name became a frequent part of Luther's letter writing, she also began to be represented as a dominant figure. Von Bora is told to have said before their wedding, "I have to train the doctor a bit differently to get him do what I want." And Luther said to his wife about 10 years after their wedding, "You persuade me in anything, you have the power." Of course, the dynamics of a married couple are always dictated by intersection of factors such as gender, social background, age, and the individual character of a person. The dynamics are also subject to change by virtue of the passing of time and differing situations in which roles are negotiated and renegotiated. Such was the case with the Luther couple as well. And one of the obvious reasons for allowing von Bora a very different position than other women, besides her personal character, was Luther's own benefit. He could fulfill his role as intellectual and public figure more easily by letting his wife to be in control of most of the other things. One has to note, however, that the role Luther allowed for his wife or other real-life women he appreciated, such as Argula von Grumbach or Katharina Schütz-Zell, did not really change his theoretical ideas about women and womanhood. Further, there was a host of real-life women that Luther tried to push to their proper place as obedient and subservient little wives. Hence, my study questions the often repeated view of the influence of Luther's marriage on his, quote, new perspectives on the dignity and responsibility of women. This claim cannot be validated concerning his text of the 1520s. One thing that has reserved quite little scholarly interest thus far, and which my study brings to the fore, is Luther's view on masculinity. For Luther, the man was, of course, as has become evident this far, the man was the crown of the human race. Luther praised masculinity, for example, in the following way. How great are the gifts of the body, form, strength, health, and the alertness of the senses, which in the male reach their peak, as he is the more noble sex. This enables him to carry out many things, both in public and private life, and many distinguished and proper deeds to which woman is a stranger. In another context, he continued this line of thinking by noting, men have a firmer and more vigorous body than women, and they die later. For Luther, masculine features were strength, rationality, and prudence, control and order, which as such were a straight continuum to many medieval views on masculinity. And in line with his discussions on women, Luther thought that man's proper way of being consisted of husbanding, fatherhood, and making a living for the family. But this was only one thing the man was entitled to. In women's case, it was, in theory, the only thing that they were entitled to. As I quoted, in Luther's mind, men were able to carry out many things, both in public and private life, and many distinguished and proper deeds. But like in the case of women, in the case of men, Luther was often more flexible in practice than in theory. And my example of this is Luther's colleague, Philip Melanchthon. Melanchthon, who is described in modern research as hardy in comparison with the stout laurel figure of Luther, was somewhat weak and sickly, not only in terms of his outer appearance, but also his mental qualities, mental composition. Luther himself noted that Melanchthon was fragile, pathetic, and weak. These were words he used to describe women most often. But this did not lead to a conclusion of Melanchthon's femininity or his improper way of being a man, but quite the contrary. Melanchthon, as a matter of fact, became Luther's prime example of humanity and of evangelical manhood. Other men that Luther thought were too soft or emotional, for example, often received different treating. Luther could simply command them to be men. One of the exhortations to his contemporary men is the following, addressed to his colleague Stefan Roth, who let his wife take a lead in their relationship. For Luther, this was most improper, which he put in writing in the following way. And I don't have a quotation of it here. So Luther wrote, "Now it seems to be your fault too that your wife dares to challenge you in everything. Certainly, when you understood that the donkey runs riot because of overfeeding of fodder, that is, your wife is arrogant due to your kindness and obedience, you should have acted in a manly fashion. It is too much that God's honor in man is entirely removed destroyed, and made into nothing. The prerogatives that Luther described as man's part were the result of an essential difference between male and female bodies. Thereby, gaining social acceptance was also, in the last resort, based on the male body. One of Luther's central ideas of the hierarchical gender system was, however, that it was not all about prerogatives for men. Instead, their position demanded them to be upright Christians, to make a living by the sweat of their faces, as the Bible said, and treat their wives well. A revealing example of desired behavior and male responsibility is the question of normal domestic violence, which was approved by both secular and ecclesiastical leaders. In the late 1510s, Luther still advised husbands to discipline their stubborn wives physically, and this was an advice which was perfectly in line with the contemporary customs and laws. A few years later, he did not give this kind of advice anymore, but was silent about the issue in his writings. But however, he kept on ruminating the question, and in the beginning of 1525, he noted explicitly that it was improper to represent one's masculinity through violence. To sum up a bit, in terms of all the range of human life, from day-to-day life to salvation, body played an important role in Luther's thinking. And together with his colleagues, Luther formulated Christian anthropology anew, wherein the human body and its urges were made the explanatory factor, so to say. Accordingly, societal deductions concerning the gender system were made in accordance with the rhetoric concerning the body. In most of Luther's writings, whether sermons, treatises, or correspondence, he formulated quite strict ideals and norms concerning gendered way of being. However, the common femaleness or maleness, the ideal Christian that Luther constructed in his writings, was something that had even rather little to do with factual women and men of his time. At times, it seems that his production of common femaleness or maleness is a wholly other discourse than the one concerning individual people. And from my point of view, this is most essential when discussing Luther's insight on the human being. When speaking of the general level, Luther explains what it is to be a woman or a man through the idea of difference, which lies heavily on the understanding of two complementary creatures, two different bodies, two sides of humanity, as it were. Determining for this idealistic view on femininity and masculinity is that it does not take into account the differences between individuals of the same sex, and thus personal ways to realize one's gendered way of being. In that discourse, there is need for only one representation of the man or the woman. And in the case of people of real life, on the other hand, Luther had to see the difference between individuals, as each person and situation was unique. The discourse that creates common femaleness and maleness, the level of generalization, is often the one that is taken as a point of departure in scholarship concerning Reformation anthropology. My thesis shows that the individual level and Luther's approval of surpassing the gendered boundaries, so to say, is something constitutive in his thinking as well. And thus, it should be regarded as important part when discussing the history of Western Christian anthropology. Thank you.